So you were talking about the government failure and how you don't think that that's sort of as big a concern because you think everyone's sort of on the same page, so lobbying isn't such a big thing. But I would argue that lobbying is still like a huge problem within like our climate change reaction. I mean, you just have to sort of look at what's happening in America at the moment to know that people aren't all on the same page, and if anything, they're on the same page in a negative direction. So, I just wondered if you could like speak a bit more about that because I wasn't entirely convinced.
No, I didn't mean to say that lobbying and government failure of all kinds are not a problem. I was referring to a very particular type of lobbying problem, which is that people can misrepresent the solutions and they can push in different directions to promote their sexual interests rather than solve the climate change problem. At least in terms of what solution we need, I think there's strong scientific consensus. For example, if the government is contemplating whether to promote something like Concorde planes or to develop biotechnology industry and so on, there can be a lot of lobbying about what to do. People can say, we need different airplane technologies or biotechnologies that got no future or whatever. But in this case, I think technological solution is there. So at least on that account, we don't need to worry about government failure. However, as I already said, why do governments prefer carbon market to taxes? That's a result of corporate lobbying. Why do they not even auction these permits? Well, I mean, there have been proposals to auction these permits, but the EU's ETS ended up just giving away the permits. If you auction the permits, at least the government can get some revenue. So yes, I mean, there are a lot of things that are happening because of lobbying. And on top of that, we have fossil fuel companies and certain interest groups that are lobbying to deny the existence of the man-made climate change. And so I didn't mean to imply that. I mean, this is one area where we don't need to worry about lobbying because what's going on has a lot to do with lobbying. But I was trying to argue that on that particular score of what to do, what kind of technologies to use, we seem to have a very strong consensus.
You've sort of phrased this lecture here as essentially two aspects. So you've had market-based versus tax and regulation in terms of tackling climate change. But both of those pretty much sit well within a capitalist framework. So how would you answer people who would sort of say that green capitalism isn't possible, that the infinite growth imperative of capitalism doesn't really sit well with any form of environmentalism, finite resources of the planet, etc.?
In discussing alternatives, I mean, you can go, to different distances, so to speak. So mainstream neoclassical environmental economies are trying to solve these problems within the market mechanism, taxes, pollution permits, carbon markets. There are other environmental economies who say, no, we need, on top of that, regulation, bans, and so on. And then you can go, even further and say, we need to rethink the whole system. We may need to abolish capitalism or at least create kind of different types of collective ownership over environmental resources. And so we can go much further down. But yes, I mean, we couldn't discuss all of this in these lectures. So we basically set our limits to basically discussing solutions that are accepting that fundamental changes to the economic system and property ownership and ownership of nature and so on is not likely in the near future. So I mean, conceptually speaking, yes, I mean, those things need to be discussed, but as I mentioned in another lecture, we may want to set our goals very high, be very radical, but, in getting there, we need to be realistic and gradual. So, yeah, I don't see that the overthrow of capitalist system in the near future. So accepting that it's there, what can we do? I mean, that is how we thought when we developed these lectures.
Do you think that it would be possible to use sort of the permit system, but maybe that the worth of each permit could reduce over time? So that would be a way to encourage companies to innovate because they know that their permits will be worth less. So do you think that that's like a method that could be used?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting suggestion. Yeah, no, I mean, something like that would, I mean, given all the kind of structural limits of carbon markets, that doing something like that will give more incentive to innovate in terms of green technologies. Because if you say that the value of this will basically gradually be reduced and disappear in like five years, you basically have 5 years to do something about your production technologies. Now, I'm sure there are lots of ways that we can improve the workings of the carbon market. I talked about auctioning the permits. I mean, that's one way to, because if the government auctions the permits, it can use the proceeds to invest in the green technologies. What you have just suggested is another very interesting suggestion to create a bigger incentive to innovate while accepting that current technology is going to be current for a while. And I'm sure that we can think of many other ways to improve the workings of carbon markets or carbon taxes. But I think the difficulty with dealing with climate change is that, I mean, it's not feasible to overthrow the capitalist system, but we at least need to actually restructure a lot of our lives other than the domain of production. Because a lot of emission comes from the way we live, So, Europeans find it easy to feel virtuous against the Americans because they cycle 10 miles to work, But if you are some guy stuck in a suburb of, I don't know, Texas, Austin, you're not going to cycle 70 miles each way to work, So in that kind of society, you need to reorganize the living space altogether. So how are you going to do that? I mean, that requires a lot of infrastructure investment. That requires that a complete change in people's idea of what is a good life, because a lot of people move to suburb because they want a garden, they want to do barbecue in summer, they want the children to play around. It will be much more carbon efficient if you compact them in the way they are compacted in countries like Korea or Japan, but then you will have to live in an apartment block which is 45 stories, very little greenery. People have to accept that that might be the cost that they personally have to pay to live in a low carbon economy. So, I mean, we've only discussed the domain of production, but there are so many issues like consumption, lifestyle, even the very idea of what is good life, that need to be looked at, and that's what makes it so difficult.
So one of like the big topics that come up is that it's countries that have already developed that are then sort of pointing the finger at developing countries and saying, you need to cut your carbon, when we're the ones who have sort of, I mean, I'm saying that as a British person, have reaped the benefits of it in the past. So I guess, I don't really know what the solution is to that. And do you have any thoughts about?
I mean, these greenhouse gases stay in the atmosphere, I mean, for a long time. I mean, I think the usual figure is 100 years. So what was done in, say, Edwardian time is having impact now. I mean, on rough estimates that people say between 70 and 85% of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere come from the past activities. Of course, the rich countries can put up the defense that, well, I didn't do it, first of all, and when my great grandfather did it, he didn't know that this was going to destroy the planet. Yeah? So yes, I mean that I accept that this was not done out of kind of total malintent, But having done that, a lot of developing countries agree that these countries are now pushing the responsibilities on them and say you cannot develop because we are running out of the planet, so to speak. Well, I think that the solution should be that there should be a lot more technology transfer from the rich countries, first of all, to cut down the emission in the developing countries while growing their economies. Yeah, there are some countries, China, Brazil, a few who have the capabilities to generate green technologies themselves. But if you are, I don't know, Bangladesh or Indonesia, forget it. Yeah? Those countries need to be given that greener technologies at low cost or hopefully free. Yeah? And also that many developing countries, despite not having contributed basically at all to climate change problem, are the ones that are being hit by the impact, because they tend to be in regions with a lot of climate events and low sea level, and so a lot of them need, so to speak, adaptation to climate change, and they need to be supported in that by the rich countries. Yeah? So I think that we really need kind of a global accord. I mean, fortunately, something in that direction is developing. We thought when the Kyoto Protocol tanked, we thought that this is the end. Now we have some hope because of Paris, and I think that we are inching towards a global compact, but the problem is that we are running against the clock. Do we have enough time to do this? Because it's quite slow to emerge. And then there are lots of, say, relatively technical issues that we need to settle, because how are you going to allocate your emission say the quota across countries? Because a lot of developing countries argue that no, actually, you haven't really cut your emission. You have moved all the factories with high emission to us, China, India, Vietnam, and we export those things to you. So actually, if we calculate the emission in terms of consumption, actually yours is a lot higher than what you think it is. Simply because you don't produce it within your national boundary doesn't mean that you are not contributing to emission. So how do you settle that? And how do you estimate the cost of the adaptation in countries like Bangladesh, in South Pacific countries? I mean, some of them are going to disappear. I think one of those South Pacific countries, I forget exactly which ones, was seriously discussing buying some land in Australia and moving the country. Because they are so low-lying. I mean, even a relatively small rise in sea level will get rid of the country. So, there are lots of issues that may not be as moral as, well, you did it, no, we didn't know, I didn't do it, my grandfather did it, Never mind those, there are a lot of technical issues that we need to settle to work out what would be perceived as a fair deal between the different countries.
Talking about lifestyle changes, etc., that need to be made, obviously there's lots of different changes that you could consider. But I just want to ask a question about one of them, which seems to be getting quite a lot of traction recently. So concepts around vegetarianism or veganism, particularly with regards to dairy and meat farming and the environmental impact on them. Have you got any comments on the feasibility of, for example, or the impact of dairy and meat farming and the feasibility of reducing or removing them and the impact on climate and the economy?
Yeah, well, I'm not a climate economist, so I don't have the exact quantitative evidence. But yes, I mean, meat farming, especially beef farming, is supposed to be very impactful on climate change. All this methane gas that cows generate. They are supposed to be 4 times more powerful than the CO2 in creating the greenhouse problem. And yes, I think we should all move towards less meat-based diet. To put it provocatively, I often argue that we should all eat more tofu and insects. Now, some people cringe when I mention insects, but as far as you are willing to eat shrimps, you should be willing to eat insects because they are essentially the same thing. They are arthropods. That to me, at least, that when I was a kid in Korea, we used to eat a lot of fried locusts. To me, at least locusts look less disgusting than shrimps. They have 10 legs, tentacles. They look quite scary. But somehow you would eat it. Whereas if someone offered you a little bag of fried cricket, you say, "Wow, what is this?" So we should get rid of this prejudice. And also it's a very practical suggestion, but you need to develop more kind of vegetarian and vegan recipes. Because the problem is that when you have lived with this meat-based diet for so long, even when you become vegetarian, you want vegetarian sausages. Whereas in countries with a longer tradition of vegetarian cooking like India, you don't look for those things, because the vegetables are themselves the stars, of the meal. Hopefully things will slowly change, but that's once again something that makes all of this transition so difficult because it has to be done at so many levels. What you eat, where you live, how you live, what you consume, how you locate production around the globe, And I think it's quite difficult for individuals to behave responsibly in all this because in making your lifestyle more compatible with sustainable development, you actually need a lot of information. A few years ago, I was shocked to read this article in a newspaper saying that when you go to some supermarkets in Britain, they'll have a section of local produce. So I live in Cambridge. When you go to certain supermarkets, they have this section of locally produced things, and I don't know, turnip or onions or whatever. But this newspaper article was saying that actually a lot of those locally produced things have more carbon emission than beans flown in from Zambia. Why? Because these supermarkets have a very complicated logistic system. So the turnip might have been produced near Cambridge, but then they are shipped to a warehouse in Norwich and then moved to Scotland and then run down all the way to London and then come to Cambridge. So actually some of these things are more carbon intensive than beans are flown in from Zambia. So I was quite shocked. Now the trouble is that we cannot trace all this information. That's why we need regulations. Because today there's this tendency for the corporations to hive off the responsibility to consumers. We are going to give you all the information. You make the decision. But then there are so many things that we need to know about. Whether what you are eating have been produced with slave labor, child labor, whether the producer actually did anything illegal, like bribing their government, what is the air mile, what is the nutritional content. We haven't got time and brain cells to process all this. So I think that these things need to be controlled at source. So if it is deemed that this product is too carbon intensive, then the government should legislate that you have to actually change your distribution system, or we are going to tax you for moving things around like that. Because otherwise, it's very convenient for the corporations to say that, well, we gave you all the information, and you chose to destroy the earth. It's your responsibility. But I think that's grossly unfair. I mean, we need a stricter system of regulation so that we don't have to worry about all these things when we buy these things. So, but yeah, I mean, being a responsible consumer is very difficult these days, isn't it?